Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the HEARTspeak Podcast. I'm Jordan, the producer, handling everything behind the scenes. Are you uncertain as to what anti-racism work is, or are you still wondering how you got here? Well, you're in just the right place. In this episode, Full Circle Strategies communication strategists and coaches Donisha Shepard and Margaret Mayer sit down with EAP founders Brian and Sydney to discuss why they do the work they do.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the HEARTspeak Podcast. My name is Margaret Mayer. I am a HEARTspeak facilitator and strategist here with Full Circle Strategies, and I am joined by my co-host, Donisha Shepard. Donisha, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Donisha Shepard, pronouns she, they, and happy to be here sharing space with you all. I am one of the HEARTspeak facilitators and strategists, and one of the facilitators that actually got a chance to interact with our guests today. So I'm super excited to hear their stories and hear what they want to share with you all about the great work they're doing in Colorado.
Thank you, Donisha. I want to go ahead and introduce our two guests that we have here with us today. That way we can dig in a little more to what Donisha was mentioning about the project we collaborated with them on, the work that they do, and really have an opportunity to learn more about Manaus and the Equity Action Project, words you'll be hearing us talk a lot about today, and learning more about what this is and the work that they do that is so connected to anti-racism and thinking about doing this in a new, exciting, and really, thoughtful way, a way that we don't see very often. I am going to let them introduce themselves and share more about who they are and the role that they hold. That way we can get to know them a little bit more. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Sydney. Sydney, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about who you are, your role with Manaus, what you do, and then we can go ahead and give it over to Brian after that.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I'm Sydney Shallett. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the executive director at Manaus, and I was the early co-conspirator on designing the Equity Action Project. Manaus is a social justice nonprofit that lives in Carbondale, Colorado, which is in the Aspen Valley. We have an incredibly beautiful place that we get to call home, and unfortunately, it is also home to systemic inequities, just like everywhere else. I'll probably pause, let Brian take over, and then we'll drop into more about what Manaus does later. Thanks.
Alrighty. Well, thank you, Sydney. She's definitely the mastermind behind the organization, and so really appreciative to have her on this conversation as well. Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Alvarez Terrazas. I use he and they pronouns. I've been in my role as a manager of the Equity Action Project for a little over 2 years now as well. I'm excited to chat with you all more about the project and how it all got started and where we're at now.
I would say it's cool to start there. How did the EAP project get started? What was the thought process around EAP?
In 2020, I had just started as the executive director at Manaus in April. And of course, that was about 3 weeks after the world shut down due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And there were weekly convenings of nonprofit leaders as everyone in the Valley was trying really hard to buoy our community. And we realized very quickly that undocumented immigrants in our Valley, who are the lifeblood, undisputable lifeblood of our community, who are also kind of hidden, not just like the veins they ride in, were not receiving the federal funding. And so we started a project that we were using a different project at Manaus to distribute emergency cash assistance. And so I got thrust into a position that was both very humbling and very exciting, and also really helpful for our community. During those, we had our local community foundation called the Aspen Community Foundation started hosting these weekly, really intense pseudo therapy sessions, but mostly strategy sessions with other nonprofit leaders. And I remember it was my first foray into nonprofit work is running Manaus. And we had, I bet 70 people typically on those calls. 98% of them were white women, and a majority of those white women were over 55. And so it was a very clear delineation of what leadership in the nonprofit world looks like. And a couple weeks into it, and shortly after George Floyd's very public murder by police, there was a conversation brought up by one of the very few Latino leaders about how the room should look different. And the presentation of that comment was not conductive or productive, but it did really spark a thought for me of, yeah, we shouldn't all be white women, and we shouldn't all have the same background or very similar backgrounds. Everybody's got their unique story, all that. But in reality, we're very much a homogenous group. And so the woman who was convening all of those meetings, her name's Valerie Carlin at the Aspen Community Foundation. She and I started talking a little bit with an organization called Valley Settlement, which is one of Manaus's successfully launched projects. And now it's on its own for 12 years and is Latina led and run, and is an incredible entity. A couple of colleagues from that organization, Aspen Community Foundation, and I started to really have deep conversations along with our board members at Manaus to really dig into what could we do? Because Manaus is a really unique entity in that we essentially incubate social justice project ideas and concepts and pressure test them and iterate on them and get feedback from community and change and adjust. And when they become viable, years later, we launch them into independent nonprofits. The Equity Action Project is still housed at Manaus, just due to, something we'll probably get to later. But so we started to really discuss it. And then we brought in an organization called Grid Impact, and they're longtime human-centered design partners of ours. And so they really helped structure the conversations that the three organizations, Manaus, Valley Settlement, and Aspen Community Foundation, were starting to have. And we were able to interview future participants. We knew that our scope would be very specific to nonprofits, although eventually we branched out a little bit, but nonprofits was where our experience was and where we knew we could help impact change. And I think one of the most heartening things was that nonprofit leaders were really interested in doing this work with us. They had no idea. I was a white lady in charge of a very cool nonprofit that was nimble and moving fast. And people were asking me well, how do you do this? And I was like, oh, I don't know, but we're going to find an organization that's going to come in and help us figure this out. And so after deciding really what we thought the cohort could look like and what the model could look like, which ended up being a cohort model, we sent out an RFP, and we were very fortunate to receive a response to that from Full Circle and Kenya Johnson. Lo and behold, here we are 2.5 years later.
That's awesome. Brian, I definitely want to hear from you. You were one of the leaders in EAP from Manaus. And so what was your experience like jumping into this role as a Latinx person leading this work? What was that like?
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for that great summary, Sydney. Really appreciative just hearing the whole backstory again. The way that I got brought into this work was that I jumped in during the very first cohort. So I came in, after Sydney and the folks from Aspen Community Foundation, Valley Settlement, and Grid Impact had gone through this RFP process, had interviewed different organizations, ultimately selecting Full Circle Strategies to create this collaborative cohort model. So that was up and running by the time I came onto the team. And so I was really fortunate to, come in running into the project, into this work. And, I was really happy and excited to do this type of work because I was born and raised in this region, in this valley. And from when I was a child, I noticed that, I wasn't always seen or heard, or kind of had a different experience than a lot of other folks, particularly like the white community. I went to Aspen High School, for example, so that should tell you enough about my experience there. And so I went off to college and came back to this community in 2019 and, started to see that a lot of the positions of power in the region, especially within the nonprofit sector, like Sydney was saying, wasn't totally reflective of the region's demographics. Working in a nonprofit, there was always that sort of like afterthought of, despite the fact that the Latino Latinx community is a big portion of the region, about a third of the region's demographics, it still felt like the community, my community, felt like that afterthought, something that sort of came after the initial planning, the initial service delivery, all that kind of stuff. And so I had that feeling, and then COVID hit, the racial justice movement following George Floyd's murder came as well. And I was sort of in the spot of, I want to do work around anti-racism, around wanting to support organizations with better supporting, including, and empowering the Latino and Latinx community, in particular here in the region. And so that was my sort of calling, and I got the job posting way back when and decided to take the leap. And thankfully, I've been a part of the team since March of 2021, and really thankful for that opportunity to be a part of this movement, really help to lead, trying to get more folks into this work, into, how do we better do this work? How do we better serve different populations? How do we better support and empower folks that have different lived experiences from us? So it's definitely been a learning journey along the way for all of us. And I'm grateful to still be a part of this work and figuring out how do we continue to support and move this work forward.
Thank you so much. I don't want to dilute what you both are sharing, but I want to try to sum it up and see what we're missing. So for folks listening and try to really get their head around what this project is, I'm hearing the intention behind the Equity Action Project really is stemming from this experience of being in this region in Colorado where you're realizing, nonprofit leadership looks very similar. A lot of white ladies, a lot of white folks, and we're really not being representative of the experiences of people in this community. We're not reaching everyone in this community. We're not thinking about anti-racism. We're not thinking about equity, right? How does everyone have what they need to thrive in the way that is right for them in their life? And how can we shift and support leaders to make space at the table for more folks, different folks, new people? And how do we also support the ones who are still there at broadening and understanding how to better serve the community that they're living in and amongst? Feel free to jump in and add anything if I'm missing something, but I just want to add, or ask, full circle comes in, right? And so we partner and we say, we can help you. We can bring in some education, some training, some activities, right? We can help you start having this conversation at a community-based level so we can think about how do we as nonprofits impact this work? Talk me through what came next. Talk me through how you started getting people interested. Sydney, you mentioned earlier, people wanted to do this. A question that we have is around recruitment. Talk me through what it looked like if people wanted to do it. You have this intention. How are you going to make it? How are you going to make it happen? What did it look like?
Yeah. Great multi-layered question. Let's see. So the early days of this work, Kenya was just instrumental in really supporting my and our board chairs understanding that there was just the role of an ally and the really incredibly important role of an ally to be the ones to kind of push other white folks to join and to work. And so early cohorts were pretty easy to fill because, like I said, people were interested. It was early days of the racial reckoning. And people were interested. One of the most beautiful things that Kenya did and that Full Circle provides is the HEARTspeak work. It was very difficult for my business-oriented board members to reckon with the idea that, this is a pretty big investment. And it's essentially in sort of paraphrasing, but it's essentially really deep personal work in a public setting with colleagues. It's a pretty awkward setup. And what was beautiful about it was that we really liked Kenya. We liked what was offered. We didn't understand it. And that's sort of the beauty of being a lifelong learner and somebody who lives in curiosity, which everybody at Manaus really does, is we were like, all right, well, let's see how this goes. And it was incredible. I mean, it was just incredible. The first cohort was really rocky. I know the Full Circle team that was there with us for that. We hit speed bumps we didn't expect. We hit brick walls we didn't expect. We had lots of incredible phoenixing happening after we burnt a couple things down. 7 weeks is not a lot of time. And yet in this work, it was, I remember having conversations with my husband afterwards of just like, oh my God, I need to take a nap. Like, I'm just emotionally overwhelmed. I also feel kind of lighter. I don't understand. And I would talk with some of my colleagues that were in the cohort with us, which of course, because it was the first cohort, we just got like all of our buddies to join, which was great. And the reactions, the feedback, the many times that people, you could just feel them kind of cracking open. And it never felt risky. Well, to me, but for some people, it was very risky to crack open the way they did. And it's not that I don't really love the term safe space, but they definitely felt held and they felt protected in a way that allowed for them to kind of navigate certain pieces. And boy, it was just, we can't, of course, it was all confidential, which is great. And also made it really difficult to like digest what happened afterwards. But the early cohorts were not that hard to get people to sign up for. When Brian came on board, I always joke with Brian that early days, his role was really as like an equity salesman, like, let's go get all these nonprofits to give up 21 hours of staff time during a pandemic where nobody knows what tomorrow's going to look like. Everybody is pinned. I will say the nonprofit community in this region and probably across the country, but I will say for our region, totally busted ass in a way that no one thought we could. We were doing more than anyone had ever thought possible. And they still participated in this really hard, really deep work. And so I will give them that applause. And one of the things that Brian really pushed us on early and that I pushed back on for a long time was that there weren't enough people of color in the space that were nonprofit, workers, leadership, board members, whatever. It's part of the user-centered design process that I think is a really unique role that we got to uphold, was really trying to push for the leadership has to be ready if we're going to ask them to hire a bunch of folks of color, whether it's in leadership positions or bringing them onto the board or whatever. What's the point of that? Like, talk about putting the cart before the horse. Like, if we just put a bunch of people in this very vulnerable position and then we have a bunch of white people who don't really know how to handle it or just even talk to people, I don't know, there's a lot going on there. But it was one of those tensions that I really appreciated Brian brought to the table almost immediately. It's like, oh, why am I the only person of color in the space besides the facilitators for Full Circle? And it's something that we still have lots of tension around, but Brian's figured out some really beautiful ways to navigate it. But the recruitment early on, I think the shock of not just what happened to George Floyd, which was, of course, an actual national tragedy, but the unveiling and the peeling back and the fact that everyone was stuck at home. And so nobody could look away. And so suddenly you have people who are unblinded to the actual disparities, discrepancies, racism, linked white supremacy. Suddenly it's in everybody's face and nobody knows what to deal with. And, you can read like How to Be an Anti-Racist and you can read all the other books. If you don't have the opportunity to have like a really skillful conversation around it, you're going to get stuck and you're going to feel overwhelmed. And I think that's sort of what has led to our Republican scene in education right now of like, maybe they dabbled in it and then they got scared because they didn't have the structure of HEARTspeak and the skills of facilitators that we've been lucky enough to work with Full Circle to really help balance all of those terrifying things that are a reality of our culture. And so I actually digressed completely. I apologize. But anyways, that was my early days of recruitment. And then when Brian came on board, that was a big learning, I think, for you and I, Brian, and I'd love for you to talk about it. But there was a lot of talk around using your own story. And, HEARTspeak is very much like a personal revelation of, oh, I am a white privileged person, even though I have like Jewish heritage and Cherokee heritage and all this that matters, but it is not my experience in the world. It's a beautiful piece of my history, and there's probably lots of genetic things I got to keep an eye out for. But the reality of my experience is different than the reality of an experience of someone like Brian, whose parents are from Mexico directly, and the culture is part of day to life, and therefore the barriers are also built into our system for Brian. And so what we really we continue to work on is how to navigate. Brian shouldn't have to like fillet his heart and soul in order for people to be like, oh, now I get what you're talking about. Yeah, I'll participate. But for a while, that was sort of our methodology in getting people to participate. And I don't know, Brian, I'd love for you to take over at this point and chime in.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Sydney. I remember, thankfully that first cohort was filled by Sydney and the rest of the team. So I was fortunate to be able to jump in, see what the HEARTspeak experience was as a participant, and kind of be able to learn in that way, so that when I was recruiting for the second cohort, I'd have that better understanding of, this is what you can expect. This is, the different outcomes that you can expect by going through this training. And so, like Sydney was saying, at that time in particular, you couldn't look away. It was a part of daily conversations, especially in the aftermath of, or seeing the impact of COVID and how disproportionate the service providing was when it came to the Latinx community in particular. Here in the region, folks were scrambling to say, how do we get better connected with the Latino Latinx community? How do we make sure that they know that these services are available for them and to them? So there was a lot of scrambling to figure out, how do we better connect with this community to make sure that they're supported, that they feel seen, and that they have access to these different resources. And so that condition lend itself really well for me to come in as this, race equity, social justice recruiter, sort of salesman, to say, okay, well, you have this issue that you have identified that you want to work on. Here's a solution. Here's an opportunity to dig more into what that can look like. And I think especially towards the beginning of this process, that sales pitch was a lot easier to do, and to say, although you might not see immediate results, like, this is why this work matters. And I think that was one of the challenges for me, is like assigning value and to this training, assigning value and justifying, this is why we need this amount of time. This is why this program costs, the cost that it does, is because this is the impact that you can expect. And it's not going to be, a bottom line item that you can see immediately, but it's more of that internal and personal investment that we're all committing to as individuals and as organizations. And so I think that was something that I had to learn how to really navigate and be able to put forward for, upcoming participants and organizations and that process. And I think that, touching on one of the points that Sydney made earlier too, is, for me, it was sort of a struggle to really understand like who the end user for this program was. In particular, thinking about the existing white leadership that held a lot of power, a lot of positional power, and had the power to make changes within the organizational structure, when it came to hiring, when it came to power dynamics, all those different pieces. And at the same time, I felt like, these are conversations that I should be having and that my fellow Latino, Latinx community members should be having as well. And so that was part of the conversation that Sydney and I went back and forth on is, how do we hold this space? Who can really benefit the most from these conversations and from this experience? And for me, it was sort of like a yes and, starting with, thinking about who holds a position of power, and at the same time, who can also benefit from being in conversation with Full Circle, with each other. And that's really where the affinity space model came into our second cohort to say, we want to have a multi-ethnic, multiracial space for folks to have these conversations in. And, the conversation within the white affinity space can and should look different from the conversation within the Latino and Latinx affinity space. And so happy to dig more into that later. But just going back to the recruiting piece, I'll stop there.
That's awesome. I definitely appreciate both of you sharing your stories and your experiences in the recruitment process and the beginning stages of beginning EAP with those first couple of cohorts. I don't believe I joined EAP till I think I shadowed the second cohort, and then third cohort I was facilitating. And so it was just a great experience overall as a facilitator to just see the different dynamics in a different state, right, that was doing this work and navigating this work and understanding that, it's not just the Texas thing where white folks are leading and holding all the power, right? This is everywhere. We got some work to do, right? And so definitely a great experience. I had a question, and then me talking took my question away from my brain. So here we go. So you both mentioned about this being like a 7-week process, and normally with Full Circle and HEARTspeak process, it's a year-long engagement. And so thinking about the 7 weeks with the different cohorts, what has growth looked like within within your region?
Yeah, I can jump in first. I think from my perspective, I appreciated the 7-week program approach, namely because, especially for folks that hadn't, done something like this in the past, who hadn't gotten connected with different consultants. I think especially in our rural part of Colorado, we don't have the same amount of access and connection to different consultants as we would, per se, like in Denver. And so I think what this approach really lent itself really well to was that it helped to create that first step to say, this isn't that year-long engagement. It's a 7-week engagement, which still felt like, a big lift, a big commitment for folks to really dive into. And at the same time, that amount of time was set aside for folks just about per organization. And so I think it was a good entry point for a lot of these organizations to say, we may not know what we don't know, right? And so it gave that space and that opportunity to dive into this work in a way that wasn't as big of a commitment as like a year-long engagement, but still helped to expose, these are the different conversations that could and should be happening. These are the different points where we could be, further developing, getting additional support on. And so it really helped to illuminate some of those different pieces for the participants and for the organization to say, oh, actually, this is worthwhile. These are the areas where we need additional support on. And so where do we go from here? So I would say that was, I think, one of the big sort of assets of this approach, is that it helped to create that first step forward that ultimately would lead to that longer term work. I'll pause there and see that.
I think one of the kind of ripple effects that we've seen since organizations participated in the 7-week effort was, there's definitely more board members of color on nonprofit boards than there were before. Very little leadership has changed, and I'm not terribly surprised by that. Everybody's got their rationale to that. It just didn't shock me, but I do think that in most hiring processes with the 32 organizations that worked on this with us and went through this amazing process with Full Circle. I think almost all of them, it's probably fair to say 25 of them have done pretty significant HR work internally. And, if you've got a little bit of business acumen and you're brand new to Jedi work, HR is a great place to start. We'll take it. We'd love for you to pay people who speak Spanish fluently and English fluently a little more. That's a great spot. Let's start there, or hiring practices, or, a huge shift, thanks to some funding we received from the Colorado Health Foundation, has allowed us to really help organizations dig into language justice, just the tip of the iceberg for that. But we were able to divvy up funding from the Health Foundation and actually grant it out to organizations to make sure, whether it's their website, engagement forms, outreach work, whatever, is available in Spanish. And of course, the amount was under $2,000, so it doesn't get you too far with certified interpreters or translators, but it gets you started and hopefully helps them see the value of producing a lot of their work in a lot of their products and outreach efforts in Spanish. I think that to that exact point, though, there's a lot of work yet to be done by many organizations, primarily in understanding with some empathy and some compassion. Just because you start putting stuff in Spanish, where are you then putting it? Like who's a trusted ally in the Spanish speaking community that you can give this stuff to then help distribute it? I think the term is really outreach and engagement. That's sort of the catchphrase that a lot of our nonprofit colleagues really struggle with is Latino community outreach and engagement. And I will say, though, we are worlds ahead of where we would have been without the Equity Action Project, and there's still a long way to go with our colleagues in the community. And there's a piece of the work that I feel like I'm almost weekly in heated discussion with white leadership colleagues around, a good example. Well, we offered our council meeting in Spanish and nobody came. And so we wasted all that money on an interpreter. And, I'm like, okay, well, let's lead with some curiosity. Like, what was the meeting about? Have you ever actually invited someone who doesn't speak English to that space? Is the meeting held at noon on a Tuesday, or is it at 6 p.m.? And if it's at 6 p.m., is there food? Is there childcare available? Like, not all of us have these kind of perfect little box families of like two adults, one who can stay home with kiddos after work, one who can't. I don't know. It was just a really, there's an aspect of what I think Brian and I can speak to this. Brian, you could probably speak to this a little more eloquently than I can, so maybe we'll edit this part. But essentially, there's an aspect to the work that the 7-week opportunity gave some nonprofits a little bit of a performative checkbox. And they're like, all right, we did it. That was awful. We're exhausted. We're done. And now we're going to put it on all of our grant applications that we went through this really intensive thing. And then we tried it for a minute and it just didn't work. And it's just not our culture. And you have to have certain certifications to work here and all this stuff. And so I will say again, for 25 of the 32, I think that's probably a fair number, Brian. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Really, we're like reflective, dug in, continue to take steps. Every entity is different. Every board is different. Staffing is different. But 25 of 32 is not bad to say that they are continuing to take steps. Those that aren't continue to be a little bit of a pain point for me in this work, and probably for Brian as well.
I'm on mute. Here we go. I really appreciate what you're sharing, Sydney, and I think we would need 10 more episodes for me to unpack what you both have been sharing, because there's so many there's so many things that are coming up for me, right? Like there's this idea that, I don't want people to have to learn about an experience that's not their own through pain and through hurt and, through something like COVID and being shoved in our face, or, it's trying to unpack the difference between what do we mean with this delineation between personal and professional, whenever we're all individually just showing up to work, a full person, having brought with us our full set of lived experiences, our biases, the stereotypes we hold, the idea of what is right and wrong based on the family we grew up in, that you don't leave that at the door, right? And also recognizing that this work and the work that you both committed to and that we at Full Circle saw in you both, that really resonated with us and that we still talk about all the time when y'all aren't in the room, is the fact that y'all got and understood that this work is internal and it's not external. So we know that folks don't get there overnight, and that a 7-week journey might not make someone who's new in this process understand this is that lifelong journey. This isn't you check the box, you went through the 7 weeks, and now you are going to do something for the community. You want to be doing things in community, but it's what are we doing with ourselves? How are we taking it in? What is the experience that I'm having? How am I challenging and questioning all of these things that I've been told to believe about myself and about other people? And that just goes back to that whole, oh gosh, I have to talk about this at work. I have to go through this. So it's just bringing up all of these things for me. And I have a question that's twofold, and it's in two very different directions. And I guess, go with it where you want to go. One, Sydney, you've mentioned, there's still work to do. I'm curious to know, what does that look like? What are you all doing to help support these organizations as they are done with their 7-week process? And then the other side of it is, how has it impacted you and your life and your work personally, right? We're talking about this project, but you two are both full people who participated in this. What has it done for you?
I think I'll lead with the second because I already forgot. The first was, how are we supporting the alumni? Okay. I think I'll let Brian dig into that one, because we've essentially, thanks to a lot of opportunities for training, including co-facilitating with Full Circle, Brian's really positioned himself as kind of an expert in the field in our region and a really trusted resource. And so, Brian, I'll let you kind of tap into that. For me, I think one of the ways that I can be helpful with a lot of especially white leadership, and in particular white leadership that's hesitant at this work, I am able to have some of those harder conversations now, thanks to some of the skills that I've gleaned from this work, both with Full Circle and with other trainings that Brian and I've taken, and just experiences that I've had. I think one of my little superpowers is really looking at the system of when an issue arises, at looking at like scaling back, assessing what are all the different factors that are impacting this. And so I think a lot of my colleagues really like to lean on me for some support in that way. And we've also really been connected with a lot of fantastic facilitators. And I think that one of the pieces that we're able to do is be really deep connectors and really understand, like, okay, the issue you're having is actually board training. It's not, and yes, that is a deeper issue, but the lightness of it is that we can just say like, oh, contact this group and see if they can come in and help you with your board. Or maybe rewriting your handbook is a good idea and a good place to start to getting feedback from your employees, plus some participants in your nonprofit. So I think that the sort of executive strategy and capacity for just looking at the system is something that I'm able to really help with. Brian's really developed out a pretty incredible alumni network opportunity, and I'll let them speak more to that. Personally, this work has actually really illuminated for me as a white woman, with significant privilege and lots of financial stability and all these things. It's really helped me to understand that this has to be part of every conversation I have, and getting more skilled at having that with more difficult audiences, even if they're family or friends or neighbors, whatever it is. It's been a really powerful growth point for me. It's also been a significant growth point. And I definitely am a lifelong learner, and I really, really like learning new skills and learning I learned to swim a couple of years ago. I never knew how to swim, even though I grew up in Texas. I think everyone in Texas should learn to swim. That should just be part of their curriculum. I mean, my goodness, there's a lot of water there. But yeah, so I don't know. I sort of digress, but I think it's been a gift. Like, this has been a huge gift for me to be able to articulate when I hear something or see something, be able to intervene on microaggressions. I'm the board chair for one of our fellow nonprofits, which is a federally qualified healthcare center. And we have a very diverse board, which we're really proud of. And a lot of our members have not been through training like this. And so I am in a position to really be a supportive mentor. That might be a strong word, Brian, but I'll let you poke at that if you want. Okay. A strong mentor for colleagues of color in particular. I think I can help folks navigate our wacky systems that are totally fucked, and really help them see ways through issues, ways through how to deal with aggressive bosses, how to get out of bad positions. Like, I just think it's been such a gift to me in that way, in a personal way, and to just kind of lead. I think I've always led with compassion, but now I can lead with compassion that has structure, and that feels that's empowering. And it's also empowering as I hopefully begin to step back from direct public leadership roles and really try to uplift my colleagues of color in particular to be the front face of, like, that nobody has any doubt in this community that Brian runs this project. And if they have something specific, I'm like, great. I am super happy to introduce you to Brian Alvarez-Terrazas, who's going to hopefully just school you in the most skilled way on all the things that were asked backwards about what you did. And then in the background, I'm like, Brian, you call me if you need me, I'm there, And so it's been this really incredible reinforcer and gift to be able to position myself at, I think I can say this with some confidence, as a good ally, as an active participant in allyship.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sydney. I really liked the structured compassion. That's a good one. I'm gonna keep that one. But yeah, just echoing on to what Sydney said, I think that what I witness and seeing and appreciate of Sydney is that she really does, we talk about this in HEARTspeak and in other spaces, is, allyship is a verb, it's an action. And, it takes leaning into that and knowing when and where to support and when and where to make space and room for others. And so that's something that I really appreciate about Sydney and her leadership. And, thinking about the question of what this work has done for me is really, being able to support and or challenge folks especially folks with similar identities as myself. I think that it's no secret that there is colorism and racism that exists within the Latino and Latinx community. So being able to lean into those conversations with, folks that share that identity with myself, I think is a really important piece and aspect of why this work matters to me personally, and the impact that going through the HEARTspeak process has done for me as well. I think other things that this training and being in conversation and in support with Full Circle and other folks that do this work is knowing what self-care looks like for myself, especially, having one of these marginalized identities, being in these spaces with folks that, particularly white folks and other folks where there might be microaggressions or even macroaggressions, figuring out what that self-care piece looks like, what support looks like. I think something that I've been trying to work on that I think there's still room for growth is around, figuring out what my personal boundaries are when it comes to different conversations, when it comes to, what am I willing and able to share at a given point? What spaces am I willing to step into or not? So being able to better identify that for myself is still a learning journey, but something that I'm grateful to have top of mind as I continue to do this work. I think also patience, cultural humility, and, really that self-reflection of what are my personal identities and what are my privileged identities, as well as, my oppressed identities, and where do I hold power in the different spaces that I walk into, especially as I start to think about, how do I become a better ally for folks living with disabilities, folks that, have marginalized identities, gender-wise or otherwise. It's like, what are those spaces where I can be an ally and hope that somebody else can reciprocate that for me when the dynamic changes. And so that's something that I've been grateful for going through this process. And, going back to the first question about, what does supporting the alumni look like? It looks like a lot of different ways. So I'll just go ahead and list some of them. We just had Full Circle fly into the Valley, which was an incredible experience to have y'all in person, present here in the community that y'all have been working with for 2 years now, over 2 years. That included having Full Circle reconnect and meet with the different alumni organizations, have some one-on-one consultations, which we got really great reviews and feedback about, to reconnect, see what progress has been made, and to identify what opportunities can look like moving forward. We've also had the Equity Symposium, where we brought in Full Circle as speakers as well as folks that like Sofia Chaparro, who focused on language justice, and Rene Chacon, who focused on environmental justice. So being able to create opportunities and spaces for folks to come in, learn, connect, and build that sense of support and community with one another as we all navigate these different spaces on how we can continue to grow and learn together. We also, like Sydney mentioned, offered the language justice grants to help to get folks started if they haven't invested or had the budget to invest in some of these areas, to at least get started, get connected with different consultants, interpreters, translators, helping to make those connections and helping to build a foundation for that work to continue to develop moving forward. We've also had small gatherings for alumni of the 7-week program to stay connected, to continue to feel that sense of community and support with one another, and to reflect on what's been working in one place, what's not been working in another. So being able to stay in conversation with one another, I think, is really important. And lastly, I'll also mention the Equity Speaker Series, which is a community program where we bring in different experts on anti-racism and equity more broadly to come and speak to the broader community, including the alumni, on a certain topic such as racism and its impact on public health, on intersectional environmentalism, on intersectionality more broadly, and also Full Circle's conversation on cultural humility and its work in anti-racism. And so lots of stuff happening, constantly trying to iterate and see what's working best, what isn't, how do we adjust and continue to listen to the folks that we're working with to make sure that it's in line with what they see, what they need, and continuing to provide that support moving forward.
That's awesome. I appreciate you both so much for just sharing, one, how this work has impacted you all in your different roles in Manaus, as well as in your personal circles and communities. I think it's very enlightening to hear, as you all were leading this work in the Valley, you all were also internalizing this work as you all were leading. And I think that is the major piece of it, right? It's not, no, let's check this box and get these organizations doing this work, but how can we also internalize it and do this work for ourselves and our own communities. And so greatly appreciate you all being here. We have about 8 more minutes left in the podcast. And so I just really wanted to have one last question just around, what is next for Manaus? What is next for EAP? What's coming up? What can we look forward to?
Well, I'll speak to Manaus and then I'll let Brian speak to the Equity Action Project. As I mentioned earlier, we incubate projects that are lifted up by community, and our two big ones besides the Equity Action Project. One is trying to develop a sustainable funding model, which is fun nonprofit talk for essentially trying to set up a new tax to support early childcare and education, both financially for parents to have access to more funds, for providers to have access to more funds, but also to develop a really deep understanding throughout a tri-county region in rural Colorado about the crisis that's facing early childcare right now, and not just the immediate impact, but the long-term impact on those children and therefore on the economy. That is a major lift for us, and we're really hoping to go to ballot within this tri-county region to ask our voters to set up a new tax district that would be specific for equitable access to early childcare and education, and for providers to access more funding for personal development, professional development, project and location development, all the things. The other project that we're in that's been just taking over my life for the last year is we have intervened with a housing project called the Roaring Fork Community Development Corporation. And in that, we are intervening with a lot of the mobile home park takeovers. We've witnessed over the last 5 years, many mobile home parks get gobbled up by these investment firms, and all these residents get booted essentially, or they just suffer the wrath of the fact that they live in a really aggressively capitalist society. And so we actually secured the purchase of our first park, and the intention is to support the residents in a resident takeover of ownership. That model is incredibly liberating for residents when it works. And while we have partners across the state that have done it in other ways, no one has done it in this way. And we needed to do it in this way because the legislation right now is limiting, while it supports resident ownership, it doesn't incentivize selling to residents and therefore when a bid comes in at like $3 million over asking, it's pretty hard to ask those sellers to give in. However, we were lucky enough to find a group of sellers that would sell to us in order for us to sell it to the residents. So we're in affordable housing right now and community preservation, and we're also in early childcare. So just, light, easy work, guys.
Yeah, amazing. Manaus, it's very, very nimble and wears all the hats. And so all under this umbrella of social justice and equity work within the community. And so I'm grateful to be a part of the team. In terms of what the Equity Action Project has coming up is that something that Sydney and Manaus has helped me to fully embrace is the concept of, constant iteration, making sure that we're not just doing something for the sake of doing it, but making sure that we're taking the time to reflect and seeing what works best and what can we change and how can we continue to grow and evolve with the needs of the folks that we're working with. And so with that in mind, using that moving forward, we're going to continue to have these small alumni support groups in affinity spaces, specifically for, executive directors, for board members, for the Latino Latinx alumni as well, just wanting to continue to create space for folks to come together to debrief, reflect, and to offer support for one another. Continuing to offer the Equity Speaker Series, wanting to continue to bring in experts to speak in the community, to the broader community, make connections, helping to further develop this work, whether it's around language justice, whether it's around education, whether it's around anti-racism, wanting to continue to provide these spaces for folks to come together and connect and learn. Also, I'm working on, also rolling out different anti-racism and diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings both with alumni organizations and also with organizations that didn't participate in the 7-week program. So figuring out, how do I start to roll out this work personally in the community, continuing to support folks, whether it's building shared language or identifying what next steps look like. So starting to dig in a little bit more into certain organizations and supporting them through their journey at the capacity that I'm able to. And lastly, wanting to continue to build the capacity throughout the region. This takes a whole community, right, of people and organizations to really make the structural change that we want to see. And so wanting to embolden and empower folks, regardless of their different identities, to step in and lean into this work and to, carry the flag in whatever spaces that they walk into. And so I'm really excited about that.
That's awesome. You all are busy. Doing the great work, getting into some good trouble, which is awesome. We love to see it. Greatly appreciate you all taking time out of your schedules to join us on this podcast and to really just share with folks how, the Valley is really, how you all are navigating the Valley and really doing this work, bringing forth equity in many ways, in many spaces, and how you all are really, again, internalizing that work and really just focusing on the growth and reiterating this is a lifelong journey. There's never an arrival to anti-racism, right? There's never an end game. There's never a star or a graduation and a certificate. There is just doing the work, and greatly appreciate you all for trusting Full Circle and the HEARTspeak curriculum with your community, and just appreciate again you all sharing space with us today. Margaret, can you unmute or we good? Probably not. Okay.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly. Thank y'all so much for being here, and thank y'all for believing in the work, doing the work, and thank y'all for being okay being uncomfortable. That's the minimum we need, and y'all just went in, and just huge gratitude for participating today, and huge gratitude for hopefully a lifelong relationship with you all.
We wouldn't be here without the Full Circle team, and especially Kenya. She's just a gift, and we're so grateful. It's a pleasure. Thank you all. This was such a treat.
Yeah, likewise. Wanted to echo. Thank you all so much for having us, letting us take part in this conversation with y'all, and for being connected since 2 years ago. So grateful for that opportunity, especially for myself as a growing facilitator, being able to be in community with y'all and learn from what you all do. I'm really grateful for all the work that y'all do across the country as well.
Awesome. Can't wait to see y'all in Colorado next time.
Yeah, we'll have you back.
Thank y'all.
You guys stay cool.
That's all for this episode of the HEARTspeak Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the episode and can't wait to be back in 2 weeks for a conversation on starting your anti-racism journey. Do you want to know more about Full Circle and the work they do? Please go check out our socials where you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook as Full Circle HOU. That's HOU for Houston. Depending on where you're listening from, you can either find that information in the description of this episode or on the screen now. See you later.